Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming to the Applied Economics Lecture Series. My name is Frank Weiss. I'm the Program Director. Our speaker this evening is Dr. Mark Prell, who's a statistics instructor with us. And this is his third year teaching with us. In his day job, he has a real job. In his day job, he's serving as senior economist at the Economic Research Service of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, where he studies economic and policy issues involving food assistance programs. His recent research has focused on the so-called Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP. To me, it will always be known as food stamps. He also, this is new to me, this is wonderful information. He also works across agencies to expand statistical and research applications of administrative records from SNAP and other governmental programs. Only this month he was honored by Nancy Potek, the chief statistician of the United States in the President's Office of Management and Budget. She appointed him to serve on the Federal Committee on Statistical Methodology, a committee of experts drawn from across agencies to serve as a body of consultants for the federal statistical system. So you see here, our students get their information straight from the originators. I'm glad you agreed to give this talk. The food stamp program is my favorite welfare program because it's like giving people money. Everybody eats. Mark, please. We're looking forward to this.
Good evening. I want to thank the program's director, Frank Weiss, for inviting me here today and for the support that he and also Ahmed Mahmoud have both given me in the time I have taught in our applied economics program. At the outset, I should mention that the views I share with you this evening are my own. Don't go blaming Dr. Weiss or Dr. Mahmoud if I say something outrageous. My presentation today is on the economics of SNAP. It's a major food assistance program of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, or USDA. There's a great debate in the country about whether or not it would be better to block grant the SNAP program, which means, as I will explain, having states take over the program. Among various proposals that have been discussed for SNAP, block granting is the one that is the most fundamental. In the presentation, we'll consider the views of three of our founding fathers, Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, and Hermann Southworth. What? You haven't heard of Southworth? Then I should begin the presentation by discussing each of them. Although Southworth is an economist, you'll see why we can consider him to be a founding father too. Next, I'll introduce some basics about SNAP, or food stamps. Then we'll examine the economic model that Southworth developed to appreciate the insights that we economists bring to public policy analysis. We'll explore the origins of SNAP, followed by the goals and design of the modern SNAP program. There are interesting econometric tests of the Southworth model to examine, and we'll finish by weaving together the many threads we've considered into a discussion of issues about block granting SNAP, which will leave time for Q&A afterwards. So, what are the major views of our founding fathers? Alexander Hamilton wrote most of the Federalist Papers supporting adoption of the Constitution. He thought the country needed a stronger centralized government, but one with checks and balances and an independent judiciary so that power would not be abused. He also promoted manufacturing and banking. If, like Hamilton, you become a monumental Treasury Secretary and are killed in a needless duel with a political rival, perhaps you too will be immortalized in a famous musical. Thomas Jefferson was aristocratic, vain, but deservedly so, and brilliant, the sage of Monticello. Of course, he wrote the Declaration of Independence, But we sometimes forget he did not do so alone. He was part of a committee with Ben Franklin and John Adams. It is common wisdom that a committee does a terrible job of writing anything. It takes a team like Jefferson, Franklin, and Adams on your committee to get a decent report out of it. I keep telling my boss, don't expect much from a committee that I'm on. And he tells me, don't worry, Prell, I don't expect much from any committee you're on. I'm not sure I won that argument. Jefferson promoted agriculture and the independent farmer instead of manufacturers and bankers like Hamilton did, and Jefferson also wanted more power to reside in the states, not in the capital. The American controversy over federalism, the balance of power between the federal government and the state governments, has continued ever since. Poor George Washington. He had to listen to endless arguments between these two because they were both in his cabinet. Now, some of us in this room tend to be Hamilton types, and others of us tend to be Jefferson types. And in a healthy democracy, we will have strong but civil debates. But what is important for us in this room as economists is to provide economic analysis that helps inform the public debate, or to inform debate in the boardroom of the companies that some of you graduate students might work for after completing your degrees. It is hard for a member of Congress to make decisions about public policies, or a business or a bank to make decisions about its financial strategy. Fortunately, we economists have the two fundamental tools of our discipline, economic theory and the statistical methods of econometrics. These are the two tools we need to help us and decision makers make sense of a complex world. Which brings me to Hermann Southworth, our third founding father for today's discussion. Southworth was an economist interested in agricultural issues. During World War II, he worked for a temporary agency called the War Food Administration, which oversaw the rationing the country had at the time. Southworth wrote a major economics article with the first model to analyze a government program based on an in-kind transfer, an actual product or service, instead rather than giving cash. That makes Southworth a founding father for us economists. While my discussion today is about food stamps, the lessons learned are applicable to other in-kind programs too, such as providing housing or education, or perhaps most controversial of all these days, health insurance. So let me introduce SNAP. The program serves as the foundation of America's national nutrition safety net, and it's the first line of defense against hunger. According to the Food and Nutrition Service, that's the USDA agency that administers SNAP at the federal level. SNAP is a means-tested program, which means it's targeted to low-income people. Higher-income people are not eligible. SNAP is the third most expensive means-tested program in the country, trailing only Medicaid and tax credits on earned income and child care. SNAP represents a significant federal investment, with a total federal outlay of about $70 billion in 2016, which represents over 2/3 of USDA's budget. SNAP touches the lives of many Americans. On average, about 44 million people participated per month in 2016, or about 14% of the nation's population. SNAP is the cornerstone of the nation's food assistance programs, which include school lunch and WIC for women, infants, and children. SNAP serves some of the country's most vulnerable populations: children, elderly, and non-elderly disabled adults. Together are about 2/3, 64%, of SNAP participants in 2016. SNAP provides low-income participants with electronic benefits to purchase eligible food items in retail food stores. One of the requirements for SNAP eligibility is that a family's gross income has to be no greater than 130% of poverty. For example, a family of 4 is eligible for SNAP if income is less than $26.65 per month. The image on the left shows a food stamp. That's an old style paper coupon, not used anymore. The image on the right is the new electronic benefit transfer, or EBT card. It's a SNAP card for Virginia. SNAP card can be swiped at a checkout at a grocery store, and SNAP cards can be used only to buy food. The debate about block granting SNAP makes the news from time to time. The term block grant typically refers to when the federal government provides a fixed amount of funding to a state and the state takes on responsibility for the program. Each year since 2011, the House Budget Committee of the U.S. House of Representatives has recommended converting SNAP into a block grant. Economic Insights will help us to assess the possible results of a block grant in the presentation's final segment. For now, it's time to consider the Southworth Model. The model's key issue is comparing the economic effects of an in-kind transfer and a cash transfer. We're going to imagine an experiment in which the government gives either cash or SNAP benefits and gives equal amounts of one or the other to a family to see what difference occurs based on the form of the benefit, cash versus in-kind. The model distinguishes two types of consumers. The inframarginal consumer is one who spends SNAP benefits on food plus some more of his or her own income on food in addition. The extra-marginal consumer is one who spends only the SNAP benefits and nothing more, nothing extra on food out of their own income. The model predicts that the SNAP program has the same effect as a cash transfer on the inframarginal consumers. But for the extra-marginal consumers, SNAP increases food purchases by more if they receive an in-kind transfer than if they receive a cash transfer. I need to use the Southworth model to demonstrate to you that difference, which is critically important for policy analysis. We begin with the standard economic model of the consumer, and no government program yet. Let's consider an inframarginal consumer, consumer A, and for simplification, we'll suppose that, as usual, there's only two goods, food X and other goods Y, and the consumer has the usual quasi-concave utility function giving smooth indifference curves. The initial budget constraint is conventional. The consumer maximizes utility subject to the budget constraint and has a nice interior solution at a point like A, obtaining utility level U1. No other point along the budget constraint gives a higher level utility than point A. And at that point, the familiar economic efficiency condition is met for optimizing utility, that the slope of the indifference curve at that point is just equal to the slope of the budget constraint. There's a tangency there. Or in absolute value, the consumer's marginal rate of substitution equals the ratio of prices for the two goods. Now suppose the consumer has additional income, say delta I of another $100. That extra income will shift out the budget constraint, and the opportunity set will expand to include the green area. How much does it shift out by? Think of how much more food can be bought if the extra income is spent entirely on food. If you get $100 of extra income and each unit of food costs $2, then you'll be able to buy $50 more worth of 50 units more worth of food with that $100. That's the ratio of the change in income to the price of X. And that's how much the budget constraint is moving along the X-axis. The amount of extra Y you get would depend on how much that extra income can purchase units of Y based on the price of Y. The extra income leads to an increase in the quantity demanded of food and the quantity demanded of other goods. Studies of consumer budget show that both of the food and other goods are both normal goods. So the consumer moves from the initial point A to the point B and achieves utility level U2, which is greater than the initial utility level U1. And the diagram shows that the amount of additional food the consumer purchases is this amount, from X1 to X2. Now, instead of extra income, suppose the consumer receives a cash transfer from the government in the amount C. Like more income, a cash transfer can be spent on either X or Y, with the cash transfer equaling the amount of extra income, say C equals $100. The consumer moves from the initial point A to B. which is just like what happened under the cash transfer. The budget constraint has shifted by the same amount, although here it's C over PX. And the diagram shows that we've got the same increase in the quantity demanded for food. So utility maximization brings us to point B again. So the result is that cash transfer is no different than extra income. However, the research on the economics of food stamps does have some additional terminology that's not used in conventional analysis of consumer behavior. The most important is the term marginal propensity to spend out of a cash transfer, or the MPS sub C. This marginal propensity to spend is less than 1 here, which shows that some of the cash transfer is used for food and some of it is used for Y. Now, instead of a cash transfer, let's suppose that government sets up an in-kind program instead. SNAP benefits in the amount of S are given instead of the cash transfer, and in the experiment it's the same value, $100. The in-kind program is unique because it creates a different kind of budget constraint, one that has a kink point right there, or a corner. Now, why does that occur? Well, first, the in-kind benefit shifts out the budget constraint along the x-axis, but now it's by the amount S over PX, just as a cash transfer did. But along the y-axis for other goods, there's no shift out in the constraint. And that's because SNAP cannot be spent on other goods, only on food. Imagine this, that before you got SNAP, if you had spent all your income on other goods, you'd be at that point. Now with SNAP, you're able to spend only that same amount on other goods, but the SNAP lets you purchase some food up to that point. So the budget constraint shifts out parallel all along here, except in this upper portion that can't be reached. Above that, there's no opportunity set. Now with an in-kind transfer, this inframarginal consumer moves from A to the same point B as with a cash transfer. How can that occur, though? I thought that the SNAP benefit could only be spent on food. How can the consumer go to the same point as before? Well, we economists decompose this change into 2 moves. The first is imagining the consumer spends all of the SNAP benefits on food in a move from A to Z, and that has met the rules of the SNAP program. But having met the rules, the consumer can reduce some of his or her own income that's spent on food, that used to be spent on food, and free up some of that income to spend it on other goods in a move from Z back to B. So if the consumer adds $100 of SNAP to food spending, but then cuts back on his or her own income by $90, the increase in food is just the same $10 as would have occurred out of a cash transfer. This shift in the way that the consumer is paying using SNAP to buy food instead of their own income is called fiscal substitution. The marginal propensity to spend out of SNAP is how much food expenditures increase per dollar of SNAP. And for this inframarginal consumer who does the fiscal substitution, the MPS out of SNAP is just the same as the MPS out of cash. There's no difference for this consumer. The lesson for this inframarginal consumer is that this person is not constrained by the form of the benefit. The consumer reacts the same way to cash or in kind, moving from A to B or from A to B, whichever one is given. The difference between the 2 programs is that the in-kind transfer doesn't have this upper part, but the consumer's not making choices in that upper part anyway. The story is very different for our extramarginal consumer, consumer B. At the initial condition, this consumer purchases very little food. That's not because the consumer doesn't like X. The consumer likes food, but the consumer has very strong preferences for other goods, which can include housing or the gasoline to get to work or medical care, what have you. Again, the in-kind transfer creates a kink, and the kink is sometimes called the floor for food consumption. It gets that name because everyone on SNAP who likes X is going to consume at least the floor, or sometimes more, never less than the floor, because this much food is available for free. Free to the consumer, that is, not free to the taxpayer. Receiving SNAP brings an increase in food to the consumer who moves from C to D and increases consumption up to the floor for food. For this extra marginal consumer, the marginal propensity to spend out of SNAP is relatively large. In fact, if initial food was 0, this consumer would move to here, spending all of SNAP on food, and the marginal propensity to spend would be 100%. Every dollar of SNAP would be spent on food. When a consumer consumes at the kink point, almost certainly the indifference curve is not tangent to the budget constraint. The marginal rate of substitution isn't equal to relative prices. Economists interpret that inequality as a sign that economic efficiency has not been met. But under a kink budget constraint, it's the best the consumer can do. But what about a different program? If the consumer received a cash transfer, instead of an in-kind constraint, the consumer would go from C to E because this utility level U3 is further out. It's above the utility level of U2. And so for this extra marginal consumer, the impact of the program is high in utility terms, but in food terms, the impact is actually smaller. Just increasing food a little compared to what it would have been under an in-kind transfer. That's because the consumer has such strong preferences for other goods that the consumer prefers to use a cash transfer to obtain those other goods instead of being at the kink point and having a lot of more food. The extra marginal consumer is constrained by the form of the benefit. In plain terms, the consumer is consuming so little food before getting the in-kind transfer that he or she is not able to easily reduce her own income to spend on other goods once the in-kind transfer is received. This economic analysis is very important to policymakers. We have a lot of moving parts in the Southworth model, so let's just summarize it in 2 takeaway lessons. The Southworth model says an in-kind transfer increases food purchases by more than a cash transfer. That's because of the extra marginal consumers. It also says the utility of those extra marginal consumers increases by more if you give them cash than in kind for the same program cost. As useful as the Southworth model is, the model has an important limitation. It ignored the role of taxpayers, like me. Why might taxpayers want the government to do something one way or the other? Well, a consumption externality is when the utility of a taxpayer, me, depends on another a poor person's consumption of food. So here's my utility function. The T stands for taxpayer, and I care about my own food that I consume and my own other goods that I consume, but I also care about the food X that a poor person consumes. If you ask me, I want the government program that gives food, not cash, to the poor. If instead the taxpayer's utility function depended on the utility of the poor, then a cash transfer program is hard to beat. That'll increase the poor consumer's utility more than an in-kind transfer. So, what are policymakers trying to do with SNAP? Policymakers have thought about their policy goals for many years. Let's investigate the origins and goals of food assistance, which go back a long, long way. So please, sit back in your seat and relax a moment and journey with me as we travel across the oceans of water and across the oceans of time, turning the clock back through the centuries until we arrive here in the Thames River Valley in England. The year is 1597. As the sun is coming up, we are approaching the city of London. Why, look, in the lower right, we can just make out the city's famous London Bridge. But we cannot pause here to see the sights. We are here for research purposes and must hurry to keep our appointment. Our journey ends as we enter the royal presence of Queen Elizabeth I. Thank you for seeing us, Your Majesty. We are here to learn about your royal wisdom in granting relief to the poor. The Act for the Relief of the Poor was England's first code of poor relief. It made each locality responsible through the parish for the area's poor. The Act created overseers who set and collected the poor rate. That was a tax rate on local property owners. The overseers distributed poor relief, mainly in-kind transfers of clothing and food. And the overseers supervised the poorhouse or the workhouse, which was farms back then. A factory-like workhouse didn't come along until much later. Overseers distinguished the deserving poor, such as orphans, elderly, disabled, from the idle poor, because benefits depended on whether you're deserving or idle. So too did punishment or being run out of town. Can't have the poor people from another parish coming into ours, now can we? Queen Liz's poor law had a long legacy. In England, it lasted 2 centuries, and it also had effects on this side of the Atlantic. British colonists brought the system along with them, establishing local support at the town and village, or sometimes the city level. Thus, prior to the Great Depression of the 1930s, it was families and charities that provided assistance to the hungry, augmented by assistance from local communities and perhaps states, but not the federal government. Then, in the Great Depression, it became untenable to rely on states and localities to meet dire needs. There was widespread unemployment and hunger. At the same time, agricultural production seemed strong. Agricultural prices were low, as were farmers' incomes. So in the early 1930s, the federal government purchased certain basic foods to support prices and farm incomes, and to help the hungry through organizations such as the Red Cross. These twin goals remain the foundation of U.S. food assistance policy to this very day. But the relative emphasis that Congress has given to these goals changes over time. Initially, the emphasis was on helping farmers, which is why I listed it first on this slide. In 1935, Congress created the Commodity Distribution Program, which bought up commodities and distributed these physical goods to low-income families, again through the Red Cross or perhaps through schools and elsewhere. We forget today how very hard those times were. You can just make out in the picture that the dresses of the mother and the little girl are the same pattern as on the sack. That picture has its own historical story. To economists, does the Great Depression give us evidence that markets don't always work very well, or that even in hard times, markets work in amazing and subtle ways? Women were stretching their very limited budgets, making clothing out of flour sacks, potato sacks, animal feed sacks, what have you. So for that competitive edge, some mills started to print floral patterns on their bags with advertisements like, "The Gingham Girl flour sacks are more valuable than ordinary flour sacks." This picture is from 1939, the same year that Congress established the Food Stamp Plan, USDA's first coupon-based program. Mrs. Mabel McFiggin was the first to participate. This stamp-based program used the retail food system rather than Red Cross and schools and so forth. Eligibility standards were set locally, which echoed the American experience that was itself rooted in England's poor law with local administration. The program used a two-color system of stamps, blue and orange, which looked like postage stamps at that time. And this was to increase food consumption and keep some purchases focused on surplus commodities. In the two-color system, participants were required to buy orange stamps with their own cash, dollar for dollar, and the orange stamps were spendable on most types of foods. Participants would then receive a bonus amount of blue stamps, worth half the value of the orange stamps. The blue stamps represented the participants' net increase in purchasing power, but the blue stamps could be used only to purchase the surplus commodities. This early program lasted until the middle of World War II and a return to full employment. We now reach the 1960s and can examine the goals and design of SNAP when it was first launched as the food stamp program. In the midst of an economic downturn in the early 1960s, concern about America's poor grew. In 1961, 8 areas in the country had an experimental pilot program that was administered by USDA, and this pilot became the basis for the food stamp program. In the pilot program, there was a system of stamps with one color that could be spent on any food, instead of the old two-color system that required purchasing surplus commodities. So this shows the focus was shifting away from reducing agricultural surpluses and toward improving the nutrition of low-income people. In 1964, President Johnson signs legislation making the food stamp program a permanent program. Congress identified 2 major goals for SNAP. One, to safeguard the health and well-being of the nation's population by raising levels of nutrition among low-income households, and 2, to strengthen the nation's agricultural economy. A political analysis suggests that food stamps received enough votes to pass because the program appealed to both goals. Congress made a finding that limited food purchasing power contributed to hunger and malnutrition. This finding is significant, and so the food stamp program is authorized. Congress did not say, based on this finding, that there was price gouging going on by farmers or food manufacturers or stores. The law didn't try to alter pricing behavior. It didn't set up national prices ceilings on foods in order to help the hungry. With a price ceiling would have resulted in shortages, as we economists could tell them. Moreover, so what Congress did do was, in finding that it was limited food purchasing power that was the source of the problem, it set up food stamps, which are supplemental food purchasing power, getting to the heart of the matter. Moreover, Congress didn't create government-owned food stores. The food stamps are to be spent in the normal channels of trade. That's a phrase that refers to the private sector, the vast network of food manufacturers, wholesalers, retailers, and the transportation system, as opposed to government distribution systems. In the United States, we're very fortunate the retail food stores are in a highly competitive market. Because it is so competitive, stores have a profit incentive to operate efficiently and keep costs and prices low. That is an important advantage over a government-run food shop. Another advantage is that the large number of SNAP-authorized retailers means that SNAP households can continue shopping at their usual food store, making for easy access. Now, SNAP's maximum allotment is the dollar amount that a household receives when a household has 0 net income. Now, net income is a special SNAP term that refers to your gross income minus a housing deduction and some other deductions. A one-person household in 2016 with 0 net income would get a maximum allotment of $194 per month, which works out to about $2.12 per meal. The maximum allotment for any of these household sizes is based on the Thrifty Food Plan, which is the estimated cost of a low-cost, nutritious, palatable diet. The Thrifty Food Plan varies by family size. So big households do get more SNAP benefits than smaller households. But there are economies of scale. Larger households get less SNAP on a per person basis. For example, you can see that a household with 2 people does not get quite double what a 1-person household gets when both have 0 net income. Now, this additional column shows that the average monthly benefit is less than the maximum allotment at any given household size. That's because a household that has a positive net income instead of 0 doesn't get as much SNAP benefits as the maximum. As net income rises above 0, SNAP has a benefit reduction rate, or BRR, of 30 cents on the dollar. So for each $1 increase in net income, the amount of SNAP benefit is being reduced from the maximum allotment by 30 cents for each of those $1 steps. That also means that you get to keep 70 cents of SNAP as you earn an additional dollar, which preserves some work incentives compared to reducing SNAP by $1 for every dollar that you earn. That's not how the program is set up. Although SNAP is an in-kind program, structurally it is much like a negative income tax. Over the years, Milton Friedman and other economists have recommended a negative income tax plan to replace the ensemble of various in-kind programs. In a negative income tax, the government assures everybody of some minimum guaranteed level of income, I sub G. Call it a grant. But then, for each dollar of its own income that a household earns, some portion of that grant is taxed away. Disposable income rises as you earn more, but not by a full dollar because of the implicit taxing away of the grant. The slope of the line for your disposable income is what you get to keep, and that's 1 minus the implicit tax rate. What the government pays a family under a negative income tax is the difference between the family's earned income, which is off of the 45-degree line. You can measure earned income using that line, and the disposable income line. So that difference is how much transfers received or how much taxes paid. Eventually, at some break-even level of income, the grant has been entirely taxed away, and after that point, the household starts paying a positive amount of taxes to the government, and the disposable income line is below the earnings line. May the odds be ever in your favor, and you always owe the government some taxes. That means you have earned a high amount of income. The country has not adopted a negative income tax plan, but structurally, as I mentioned, SNAP is a lot like negative income tax. The maximum allotment is akin to the grant, and SNAP's benefit reduction rate of 30 cents on the dollar is like the implicit taxing on earnings. The negative income tax diagram illustrates trade-offs that show why policy making is so hard. Some people might advocate that Congress should lower SNAP's benefit reduction rate. That would increase work incentives by lowering the implicit tax on earnings. That could be a good idea. But there is an economic trade-off shown in the diagram with the benefit reduction rate dropping from BRR1 to BRR2 and making the line less steep. So the lowering of the implicit tax rate means you get to keep more of each dollar you earn. But by not taxing away benefits so much, this is increasing the program's costs. There's the additional program cost at any given level of income. Another policy option is to lower the maximum allotment. That would save costs to the program. But again, there's a trade-off. People with no income would no longer receive the Thrifty Food Plan. And people with higher income would be expected to pay more out of their own pocket for food. The lessons from these two graphs is that policymakers face difficult trade-offs, and a government program is a complicated system. Changing one part has economic repercussions in other parts. Now, so far we've been focusing on economic theory. it's time to pull out the other tool in our toolkit, econometrics, and examine some empirical studies on the program. In so doing, we are following in the footsteps of Galileo, whom Einstein called not only the first physicist, but also the first scientist. Science has two components, just as a walnut has two halves. Science has a theoretical half and an empirical half. And science is strongest when it combines both halves. Galileo did not assume that the physics of the ancient Greeks was true, simply because the theories seem so reasonable. They must be true, right? Not necessarily. He put the models to the test. And he showed that Aristotle, the most revered of Greek philosophers, was simply wrong. Throughout your career, when somebody is making an argument or proposing a change, ask them, what's your evidence? And it is important to be self-critical as well. Ask yourself, what's your own evidence? So as good scientists, we had better put the Southworth model to the test. Like other economic models, Southworth's model seems so reasonable. But can we observe its predictions in actual data? The key prediction of the Southworth model is that the marginal propensity to spend out of SNAP is bigger than the marginal propensity to spend out of cash, at least for those extra marginal consumers. Here we'll see how to translate the theoretical model into its econometric counterpart, a statistical model that both embodies the theory and conducts a test of it. The unit of observation is a SNAP household. That's what the data describe. A multivariate regression is used to statistically control for the effects of various independent variables. A typical specification has the for estimating the marginal propensities to spend out of SNAP benefits and out of cash, has the household's food expenditures on the left, and then SNAP benefits and cash on the as right-hand side variables. Often there's also demographic information, and here's our familiar, friendly Greek epsilon for our error term. Now, in this equation, the coefficient on SNAP benefits measures a key parameter. A $1 change in SNAP benefits on the right-hand side would be expected to change the food expenditures of the household on the left-hand side by some amount. That's the slope coefficient that's going to be estimated, and that is the theoretical marginal propensity to spend out of SNAP that the Southworth model was talking about. Now, what does cash income mean for this regression? How is it to be measured? Well, suppose the researcher gets SNAP household data on net income and uses that in the equation as the cash income variable. If the researcher runs this equation, the computer blows up. Well, the computer will not literally smoke and explode. Instead, it's the inverted matrix in the estimating the coefficient of x prime x inverse x prime y that blows up, in the sense that this matrix is going to be going off to infinity. We cannot invert the x prime x matrix when two variables are perfectly correlated. That creates a linear dependency among two columns in the matrix. Now, if you haven't had econometrics yet, you haven't had to worry about blowing up your computer, but you'll get there. The source of the perfect correlation lies in the SNAP benefit formula. Remember the graph that showed that SNAP benefits are falling by 30 cents on the dollar? Well, that's the equation here. The SNAP benefits are the maximum allotment minus 30 cents of the net income, and there's no error term because this equation holds exactly. That's the law, that's the formula. As a result, in the regression, there's going to be a perfect correlation between these two variables. Every time net income for the household changes around, SNAP benefits changes around by 30 cents on the dollar in perfect lockstep. The regression won't be able to separate out the separate effects of the net income and the SNAP benefits because they don't have separate effects. They both move together exactly at the same time. So the lesson here is that, well, there's a variety of lessons. We're going to first get around the collinearity problem by using gross income instead of net income. Remember that gross and net income differed by the housing deduction. Consumer behavior might actually depend on gross income anyway. So in thinking about what do I mean by income, this may be a better answer. And it sidesteps the collinearity problem because two households with the same gross income can have different amounts of SNAP benefits based on different housing deductions. So that's what's going to give identification in the econometric regression. So what we see is that you need to have separate variation in your right-hand side variables to estimate their separate effects, and that makes sense. And the lesson is to always think about the processes that generate data and also the processes that generate your error terms on the end. A comprehensive review by Fox and others examined 21 studies of the marginal propensity to spend out of SNAP. Now, each of the studies has caveats that I don't have time to go into here, and these studies give different values for the marginal propensity to spend based on what data they were using and what the regression specification was. So the values, the estimated parameters vary around from about 0.17 to 0.47. What this means is that for a $1 increase in SNAP benefits, that's going to increase food expenditures by an estimated 17 cents to 47 cents. 28 cents is probably a pretty good reasonable summary value. Okay. Now, here we have the various estimates for the marginal propensity to spend out of cash, ranging from about 0.5 to 0.17. So you spend about a nickel to 17 cents on food when you get additional cash. But the marginal propensity to spend out of SNAP is in this range, above the marginal propensity to spend out of cash. So what we find is that econometric studies typically conclude that there's statistical evidence that confirms the Southworth model. Right now, Galileo is smiling that we followed the scientific method to the end. Or is it the end? After all, the food stamp program was established for two goals. Help the poor and help agriculture. What's the evidence the program is doing that? Well, here's the evidence that it's helping agriculture. The marginal propensity to spend out of an in-kind program exceeds the marginal propensity to spend out of cash. So that's supporting food spending and that's supporting agriculture. As far as helping the poor is concerned, the question was considered by Rebecca Blank, an economist, a former undersecretary and acting secretary in the Department of Commerce, and now chancellor at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. In 1997, she conducted a landmark study of public assistance programs and concluded evidence of severe malnutrition-related health problems has almost disappeared in this country. The primary reason is food stamps. Our empirical examination of SNAP's effects has an important macroeconomic effect to consider. In the 1970s, SNAP started to function as an entitlement program. The meaning of an entitlement program is that benefits are available for everyone who applies for them and is eligible. There is not a fixed budget for SNAP the way there is for other programs, such as housing assistance. Because it functions as an entitlement program, SNAP is affected by economic conditions. The program expands when unemployment rises and incomes fall, and contracts as the economy strengthens and incomes improve. An important research finding is that SNAP is second only to the unemployment insurance program in its responsiveness to the economy. As shown in this diagram, as the unemployment rate is going up and down, so too is the number of SNAP participants. Now, various policy changes are also affecting the number of SNAP participants. Unemployment is not the only variable that matters. But because SNAP is responsive to the economy, this changes everything. And everyone agrees with me, such as Milhouse from The Simpsons, and other people, both famous and infamous. This changes everything. Let's suppose there are idle or underemployed resources in the economy, like during a recession. Then, if there is additional spending by SNAP participants, that spending augments the income of other people, such as farmers and retailers and food processors. And then those retailers and truckers turn around and spend some of that extra income they've received on clothing and on furniture. And then the people who are selling the clothing and furniture have more income, and they turn around and spend. And this goes and creates a ripple effect through the economy, a multiplier process supporting macroeconomic spending and production. That's a macroeconomic theory for SNAP spending. When put to the empirical test, what do we find? An increase of $1 billion in SNAP benefits increases GDP by between $1.73 and $1.79 billion. An estimated 8,900 to 17,900 jobs are created by that $1 billion increase in SNAP spending. Thus, SNAP serves as an important automatic stabilizer. SNAP is one of the nation's primary counter-cyclical programs, expanding in recessionary conditions automatically to help support the economy and then diminishing in economic booms. We now have many points to bring to the great block grant debate. As we saw earlier, each year since 2011, the House Budget Committee has recommended converting SNAP into a block grant, turning the federal dollars for the SNAP program and sometimes other programs over to the states for the states to use. What would Jefferson say about block grants? We know that he did say the government closest to the people serves the people best. Today, a person with the Jeffersonian spirit would say, block grants rock. Now, Hamilton urged his countrymen to learn to think continentally instead of focusing on states. The Hamiltonian spirit would argue to block grants. What would our third founding father, Southworth, say? To see his answer, we'll suppose that a state can spend SNAP block grants as the state sees fit. And Southworth Model tells us that the food spending decreases for the extra marginal consumers. And there's the econometric evidence that confirms the Southworth Model. So what is the relevance to the block grant debate of Southworth? Remember the twin goals of helping to reduce hunger and malnutrition, helping the nutrition of the poor, and the second goal of strengthening the agricultural sector. The Southworth Model tells us that those goals would be met less well if block granting SNAP results in states shifting to a cash transfer. And it may be that states shift some of the funds to other state priorities too, with their own fiscal substitution, using the federal funds to adopt policies or budgetary allocations that differ from what national policymakers may prefer. National policymakers understand all of that. Now, we can ask why it is that national policymakers have these two goals. Is it because of taxpayer preferences? Is it because of other stakeholders like farmers who prefer an in-kind transfer? Or it could be all those things are going on. So that's what Jefferson, Hamilton, and Southworth might think. Let's turn to some of the actual current arguments being used. Here, an argument favoring block grants and state flexibility over national uniformity is from the U.S. House of Representatives. And they were saying that block granting SNAP would provide states the flexibility to come up with innovative approaches that best address their specific needs and circumstances. That's the Jeffersonian argument of keep government close to the people. A closely related argument is not from Jefferson specifically, but it is compatible with the Jeffersonian spirit. It uses the metaphor that the states are like laboratories of democracy. That argument was used by the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office when it said that allowing states more flexibility in operating SNAP would result in more experimentation, and approaches that were successful in some states could be adopted in others. I turn now to Hamilton-like arguments that favor national uniformity, thinking continentally. The most general type of argument rests on horizontal equity, a type of fairness. Under a nationally uniform policy, participants face the same rules regardless of where they reside in the country. We should all be treated the same, according to this argument. A closely related argument is that a person's nutrition needs do not vary by state. So a nutrition program, at least, should be giving the same benefits to everyone in the country. A third argument is administrative simplicity. For example, we have just one set of rules for which foods SNAP allows. The administrative capacity argument asks about the ability of states to administer the program. For example, states may lack the resources of the federal government to combat fraud. Rebecca Blank discussed the race to the bottom argument. Giving states discretion in setting benefits and public assistance programs may result in migration of low-income families from low-benefit states to states with more generous benefits. States may choose to shrink benefits out of concern that higher benefits would serve as a magnet. This behavior would prompt a competitive race to the bottom in benefit levels among the states. There is a third issue in the Great Block Grant debate that we have not touched on at all, and that's on the level of funding. If Congress sends a block grant to a state, Congress can fix or set that level at a high amount, a low amount, or somewhere in between. If a block grant results in less funding than the state would get under SNAP, then that cut in benefits has effects in addition to the state changing the form of the benefit or shifting some of the funds to some other state priority. The House Budget Committee has expressed concern over state incentives, saying that states receive more federal funds if they enroll more people in the program, thereby providing an incentive to states to enroll as many recipients as possible. So the committee says that a cap on federal spending via a block grant would eliminate that incentive. So that argument says that a block grant can help save money by changing states' incentives. There are other ways that a block grant can save program costs. It can reduce federal paperwork requirements, although I don't think that's a very big savings, and I don't know others who would. A block grant can save money by setting the initial block grant low. Finally, a block grant would mean that SNAP is no longer an entitlement, and as a result, the program no longer responds automatically as economic conditions change. And so this raises micro and macro issues. If SNAP is not an entitlement and no longer responds automatically in the recession, then the block grant will be saving taxpayers money. But there's a trade-off, because first, it means that potentially there's an increase in the nation's prevalence of hunger, because there would either be fewer participants or less benefits per participant, or both. And second, it would keep SNAP from serving as an automatic stabilizer for the economy. There are fiscal issues at the state level too. In a recession, could a state use its own funds to supplement the fixed block grant from the federal government? Well, there's no prohibition against the state using its own funds, but the increased need occurs right when the states can least afford it. The state's own tax revenues are falling during a recession, and in most states, the state budget is required to be balanced. This suggests that if extra dollars are to be spent on nutrition support in a recession, those will have to be federal dollars. To summarize, complex issues interact. we have three sets of issues in what I'm calling SNAP's policy triangle. At one point is the level of government that makes decisions. Will it be the federal government or state powers? Second point is the form of the benefit. And at this point of the triangle is the controversy over cash versus in-kind benefits. The Southworth model tells us that there's a difference between those two in how much a program supports food. And we saw the econometric evidence back that up. Finally, at this point of the triangle is the level of spending, which matters in addition to the form of the spending. Saving costs can be a good thing, but many people argue that supporting nutrition for the poor and achieving macroeconomic stabilization are good things too. The policy debate on SNAP block grants reflects the voices of many stakeholders. Ultimately, policy decisions will reflect a combination of two things. First, our values. Do we tend to be Jeffersonian or Hamiltonian? And second, the policies will depend on how we think the world works. It is in support of that second factor that Southworth developed his model. And it is in support of figuring out how the world works that the rest of us economists do our jobs. We provide the objective analysis that uses the two halves of science, the theories and the evidence, to help everyone in a debate recognize certain realities of the world, like budget constraints and trade-offs. What you and I strive to do is to make the debate in Congress or in the corporation boardroom more informed and ultimately more effective in building a better tomorrow here in the United States or anywhere around the world you take your Johns Hopkins skills with you. Thank you and good luck.